The C-SPAN networks bring you long-form public affairs programming from the nation's capital and are a public service of your television provider. C-SPAN, created by cable.
And as we continue our series on the communicators, talking with some of the telecommunications associations headquartered here in Washington, this week we're joined by Shirley Bloomfield, who is the head of the NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. She's here to talk about some of the legislative and policy issues that her association faces. Ms. Bloomfield, what is the NTCA, first of all?
Well, the NTCA is a national trade association, and we represent 900 small local providers that are in pretty much every state in this country who provide what used to be, just basic telephone service. They're now broadband providers. They're also become kind of the one-stop shop tech service providers for their communities. They do video, they do wireless, they do data centers. They do whatever technology needs their communities actually require. So we actually represent their interests here in Washington, D.C.
Just to give us a sense of who you represent, who are some of your members?
So we have everywhere from the largest cooperative in the country, which is ORI Telephone Communications Cooperative down in South Carolina, which has about 100,000 subscribers, to we've got numerous small companies, family held, locally owned in Iowa that have 400 or 500 subscribers apiece. So we kind of serve all across the country. If you actually looked at the map of the United States, we serve about 40% of the landmass, but about 5% of the customer base. So when you think about, here in Washington, D.C., where you have a large provider providing service, they have 130 subscribers per mile of wire. My folks averaged about 6 or 7 consumers per mile. We got a lot of land out there.
Are your concerns, your legislative priorities different than the Verizons, the AT&Ts?
Absolutely. By definition, Peter, when you think about, what a rural community looks like, and the fact that you've got a huge obstacle of distance, you've got geography that kind of works against you. So again, if my folks are out there stringing fiber, which is an incredibly important part of the new technology, out to their subscribers, to their schools, to their hospitals, they're going through a lot of land where you don't have a lot of people. You may actually have more cattle than you've got people out in some of those areas. Whereas if you're a service provider like Verizon or AT&T or some of the larger companies, here in Washington, D.C., you get about 130 subscribers per mile of wire. So your costs are the same because that fiber doesn't get any cheaper based on where you're putting it in the ground, but the number of customers you have to sustain those costs is very different. And yet at the same time in rural America, in some ways it's even more important that you bridge some of those handicaps of distance so that kids can have access to educational opportunities. You've got access to healthcare opportunities. So the technology in some ways takes on an even greater role.
So given especially the geographical issue that you've been talking about, what's a legislative or policy issue that you're promoting here in Washington?
So one of the tenets that is incredibly important to the carriers that I represent is the concept of universal service. And that is the idea that all Americans, no matter where you live, should have access to comparable and affordable telecommunications services. So as we have gone through this evolution over the last several years of going from plain old telephone service to a broadband world, to an IP world, how do we ensure that rural Americans have access to those same services and those same applications that come across those networks? And so that's really been a big focus for us, both legislatively and certainly with the FCC, talking to them about how important it is to maintain the tenets of universal service, what that means, and how that mechanism has allowed folks in rural high-cost areas to actually have comparable services.
Well, joining our conversation is Matthew Schwartz, who's a reporter with Communications Daily.
Thank you. Ms. Bloomfield, in 2011, the FCC instituted massive reforms of the universal service regime. They reduced the amount of support that they give to rural carriers in some instances. They implemented a quantile regression formula, which has been the subject of much angst at the FCC, where they now compare rural telcos to their similarly situated peers to determine if a cost is high. How have these new rules affected your members?
It's phenomenal, the impact that it has had. And actually, when you said the quantile regression analysis has created angst at the FCC, you can't begin to imagine the angst it's created outside of the FCC. First of all, just understanding what the quantile regression analysis does, it's an incredibly complicated, complex statistical model that is based on all these different variables that try to compare apples to apples. So when you're trying to compare the cost of a company up in Alaska, for example, where they've got basically 3 months where they can do investment, to a company that's down in the panhandle of Florida, you really just can't even begin to come up with a model that works all the way across the country for these different geographies. So the biggest impact to your question has been the carriers that I represent, and again, 900 carriers have felt such a chill about regulatory uncertainty that they've really slowed down their investing. And at a time where I think we as a society look at broadband and we say, broadband's going to be so important as we make sure that vets have opportunities to get health care without driving 4 hours to a hospital, or school children have access to broadband access to do all the things that they need to do to make sure they stay comparable to their urban counterparts. I have seen my member telephone companies and broadband providers really slow down in their investment. As a matter of fact, we did a survey recently, and about 70% have either stopped or slowed down some investment in builds that they had planned and on the books. Because you can't, you're putting money in the ground in a very capital intensive industry. If you don't know if you can recover those costs, you're pretty nervous about putting that next dollar into the ground.
Can you quantify how many dollars it's actually cost the industry not being able to invest that, or is it just 70% generic?
70% of those who respond, so I'm always nervous about throwing out what that number is because we had a very good response rate, but it's literally trying to then go state by state to figure out what projects have been pulled. A political concern has been a couple of years ago under President Obama's first administration. There had been a big stimulus effort to do broadband funding and stimulus funding for broadband support. And what we have seen is a number of those projects either aren't going to get done, or a lot of folks have turned those projects back because it's a partnership and they can't be sure that they can return their portion of the stimulus investment. So that is where you just see it's really a shame, because one of the things we have found is that every dollar that goes in the ground for broadband has a multiplier effect in terms of the local economy. And not even necessarily so much in the rural areas. As a matter of fact, we found that 2/3 of the kind of economic boost actually goes to the urban areas.
Surely that couldn't have been the FCC's intent when they passed the rules to slow down broadband build-out. Wouldn't they argue that the rules have actually eliminated waste in some areas, allowing some companies to more efficiently build out broadband?
It's one of those things where I hear where you're coming from, Matthew, and I think it's so complex. And universal service system is actually a very complicated network of a lot of different rules, regulations, how it applies to different carriers. And then you take along, the E-rate, the lifeline. There's a lot of moving pieces in there. I think the thing that I think was a little bit difficult that we sometimes do here in Washington, D.C. is we become so academic. We think about it from an academic perspective. There must be a formula, there must be a model, there must be an answer from an ivory tower. I think what would have really helped the FCC would have been getting on the ground, seeing how these carriers actually make decisions, how do they make investments, and what does it mean? I will give the FCC huge amount of credit for the fact that we are now working towards a 7th order of reconsideration, which really means that throughout the course of the last 2 years since the order came out, they basically come back and said, yeah, you know what, we know there's some tweaks here, we know we need to make some changes here. So we continue to stay at the table and have some very, very constructive dialogues with them on how to actually make this work in a real world.
Is that because of the new commissioners that have come into the FCC? Have they brought a different mindset to this?
The new commissioners, Commissioner Pai and Commissioner Rosenworcel, have neither one voted on the transformation order, so they both have kind of a clean slate. Both are incredibly thoughtful individuals. Commissioner Rosenworcel in particular, because of her role working on the Senate Commerce Committee, has long been familiar with these issues. So she came in with a very steep background, and I think both of their reactions has been, this is so complex. It's so complex that how are carriers supposed to figure this out? And until they can figure it out, they're going to fear regulatory uncertainty. And while they're feeling regulatory uncertainty, they're simply not going to build. So they actually really understand the connection between that. So to your point, then how do you build into a broadband world? How do we take this USF order, and while it needed to be done, reform was necessary, how do you turn it to create incentives for broadband deployment? And we have some ideas.
Well, Shirley Bloomfield, you've identified the problem that your member company, your association members face, but what is the solution that you're advocating when it comes to USF?
Well, I think there's a few things, to be honest with you. I think let's uncomplicate this. It's become so complicated, and it's done on an annual basis that, let's say you figure out what your USF support is going to be next year. Well, the formula changes for the next year. So when you're putting in telecommunications plant, you're building it for the long run. When you put fiber in the ground, you're not saying, this is a one-year project. Typically, it's long-term, and you've got to figure out how you can recoup your capital. So one, I think we need a longer run on how long these provisions stay in place so that we can better assess the impacts, and companies can feel better about it. The other thing that we need to do is we really need to create a fund that will support broadband. So right now, the way it has been structured, first of all, there is no Connect America fund for rural carriers. That is the fund that is really the broadband fund. It's been put in place for the large carriers and the mid-sized carriers. It is not in place yet for the small carriers.
Why?
We are still working on that. So I'm hoping that that's the next part of this process where we actually designate a Connect America fund for those 900 small companies. The other thing that we need to do, the way the order is currently written, is your universal service support is tied to voice service. So what we're seeing across the country is a lot of people are dropping their landline telephone. They just are. Young people, people on a budget, they're kind of, the redundant value of that network isn't apparent to them. So if you are out in a rural area and you have dropped your voice service, your broadband provider can't get USF support to provide you broadband, just naked DSL, naked broadband, standalone broadband. So the cost becomes prohibitive. So that's where I look at this and I think if this was partially an initiative to deploy broadband, tying it simply to a voice service in an era where, frankly, voice is not the driver anymore, broadband is, we've got to make sure that that standalone broadband USF support gets tied to broadband services.
But with 3 commissioners currently, has the FCC been at a standstill?
It's harder without the full complement, and I will be very honest with you. I'm very excited about having Tom Wheeler and Mike O'Reilly have their nominations move through the Senate. I think a full complement of commissioners at the FCC increases the depth and the breadth of the discussion and the debate. And I think it also kind of spurs it's time to start taking some action on some items that have kind of been languishing for a while. So I do think that'll be very, very good for some movement on all of the different issues facing communication providers.
Matthew Schwartz.
You've said that the rules affect broadband build-out and investment in infrastructure. Do they have even a more grievous effect on the continued viability of certain companies? For example, a per month, per line cap on the amount that the FCC will support, $250. I've read that there's been a lot of waiver requests.
Yes.
The FCC hasn't been too eager to grant.
There haven't been very many approved. Have you noticed?
I've counted perhaps 1 or 2.
That's about it. Yeah.
So are your members in danger of going out of business?
I certainly hope not. And part of our job is to make sure we figure out, first of all, how to correct this, and second of all, how to help them create a broadband future for their companies and their consumers. It's a really good question. So I think the big part of that problem with the cap is that it's retroactive too. So what it's also doing is it's applying to investments you've already made. You didn't know what you didn't know. You put money in the ground thinking you were going to complete the fiber bid to the school, to the next community, and suddenly you're finding the rug kind of pulled out from underneath you. That has been that's tough for folks. I think prospectively, I think if we can get the caps to, instead of being caps, to be triggers. I know what the FCC is trying to get at. They're trying to say, look, we need to make sure folks aren't spending too much money, that things are within a budget, which is very important to the FCC. But if you actually kind of took the QRA and instead of making those hard caps, you said, let's make it a trigger. Okay, you've tripped the trigger. We need to look at your costs. Why are they so high? What does this mean? So what I'm seeing right now is a couple of things. I'm seeing a lot of folks I had a company in Indiana last week that laid off 45 employees, 45 out of 200. They serve part of IU, Indiana University. They serve a lot of medical clinics. That's a big chunk of your workforce. That means a lot to the community. It means a lot to what you can do going forward. So we're seeing a lot of that. The other thing we're seeing, frankly, as folks trying to figure out new ways to get new revenue streams. That's not an unhealthy part of the process. How do you then monetize your network? How do you then provide different video services? How do you open, maybe you need to open a data center. Maybe you need to think a little bit more aggressively about some of your IT services. So, that's that entrepreneurial spirit is what I'm hoping will pull our folks through.
I guess I'm still trying to kind of get my mind around what is so wrong in practice with comparing similarly situated companies against each other to see who's most efficient.
Yes. So I think that there's a couple of things. First of all, there's a lot of data that gets put into that formula. And I think you've got to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. So again, what you've got, a few years ago, the FCC through the Rural Task Force had taken a look at putting a model onto all rural carriers. Just can't we put a model and put everybody under it? And what they found after some really intense analysis is that things like soil content, you're in West Virginia, you've got a lot of rocks. Well, that changes, what it costs your company to plow fiber into the ground. Alaska, Montana, North Dakota, you've got 3 months a year you can actually dig. You've got some things that are very different. So as you go through a complex analysis that's looking at the amount of road miles or the amount of stop signs, the things that kind of get thrown into it, you wind up comparing apples to oranges. And that's where a model just gets tough to work with as opposed to actual costs.
Is it possible to compare apples to apples? If they could come up with a model that takes into account road miles and soil and the difficulty of building, and they could actually make it similarly situated in that model, would that satisfy NTCA?
I think that's going to be your next task, is we're going to see if you can come up with that model. It's and I just say that jokingly, it's a tough statistical model to come up with. And again, think about my 900 carriers. They are all so unique. It is one of the things that it is not a homogeneous, kind of industry. So I think it's been harder, it's been tried, it's been difficult to do. I think if there were models that could be created and folks could choose to opt into those models, if they thought that might be a better path, you're always going to have unique circumstances that I don't think we're going to always be able to address kind of with a one-size-fits-all.
You're watching the Communicators on C-SPAN. This week we're looking at the NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. Shirley Bloomfield is the head of that organization. Matthew Schwartz is with Communications Daily, a reporter. Ms. Bloomfield, aren't the economies of scale against your smaller members anymore?
It is not easy. I will say that, again, when you're putting that plant in, it's tough to do it when you've got a small population base that you're building out towards. However, I think there's a couple of things that we're really seeing the last few years that I think has really helped in terms of scope and scale. Some of it, my folks are kind of realizing that there's a lot of synergies they can get from working together in different business areas. So one of the initiatives that I find very, very exciting is in about 30 states, my carriers have come together within the state and built state fiber networks. So they all become owners, as you will, of their own state fiber network. And these state fiber networks are doing an amazing job of doing backhaul for the large wireless carriers, for connecting a lot of large institutions. And they're able to kind of share that network not only in their own service territory, but then share the revenues they're able to generate by being able to kind of create that scope and scale coming together. So I think there's more initiatives that we're seeing in that regard. The flip side is the beauty of these locally owned and controlled companies is they are all about their customers. We should hope to get this kind of customer service. They're running into the general manager in the grocery store and it's like, hey, you know what, you haven't brought broadband out to my place yet. They're really connected with their customer base. They know what their needs are. I actually had a CEO of one of my companies the other day say that he started a terrific working relationship with their local health clinic, building a broadband network so people could do home heart monitoring, because he was bringing his mother every day to the heart clinic and kind of had one of those V8 moments of, you know what, I provide broadband. I should talk to the clinic about how we can get senior citizens connected up using telemedicine. So it's those kind of initiatives that actually it's the best part of why, sometimes big boxes aren't always the best fit.
Is telemedicine the kind of thing that wasn't really contemplated in the last iteration of the Communications Act? And does NTCA have a position on how the Communications Act should be revamped going forward?
It's a really good question, Matthew, and there's probably so many different pieces of that act that we could take a look at. And you're right, when you think of the fact that internet was only mentioned a handful of times, and you think about now where we are with telemedicine, telemedicine is an interesting one, in part because you've got the transmission piece, which is kind of the part we worry about. What are the rules? What are the regulations? How do you do cost recovery? But you've got some other interesting pieces that are even outside of what I would consider our typical realm. Medical licensing of doctors. Doctors actually have a very tough time being licensed across state boundaries. Well, when you're doing telemedicine, by definition, a lot of times you're going over state boundaries. I know it's something that Commissioner Rosenworcel has really kind of taken a look at, is how do you make some of those other rules in the medical field easier so that you can generate more interest in telemedicine. We, for example, run a healthcare trust for our own member companies and their employees. So we actually provide health insurance for tens of thousands of rural Americans who work for rural communication providers. We actually changed our specs a few years ago so that we allow recoverment of payments for telemedicine. But you've got to get insurance companies thinking that, this is a covered service. And then I think some of those initiatives will take off. But I am very bullish on the opportunity for telemedicine. And again, I look to, senior citizens aging in place, your parents live in a rural community, you can't check on them. How can you use that technology to make sure they open their fridge or their medicine cabinet? I think about, again, the diagnostic things that can be done. It's pretty amazing.
What can be done from Washington with the statutes and revamping the statutes to encourage that sort of technology?
Yeah, so that's again, when I look at it from our perspective, and you might get a different answer if you were talking to the American Telemedicine Association, who we do work very closely with. Mine is, my guys need to be able to build those networks. If they can't build those broadband networks, and DSL will simply not cut it. DSL isn't fast enough to carry a lot of the diagnostics, and a lot of my folks, while they're 100% broadband capable, a lot of them still have old copper in the ground and are providing DSL service. You need the fiber in the ground to do the things that you want to do with telemedicine. So I guess I would go back to, I need to find ways that my companies can do effective cost recovery so that they can put that plant in the ground that allows those services to kind of overlay.
Shirley Bloomfield, does that cost recovery include federal monies?
Universal service is actually a support mechanism between carriers. So I know folks like to kind of think universal service, it must be a tax, it must be a subsidy. Absolutely not. It really is a mechanism whereby the funding is collected from the other carriers, pooled, and then redistributed based on costs. The entire concept behind that was that the value of the network increases the more people you get on the network. And it was kind of a notion and a philosophy that was adopted, in 1930, 1935 with the first Communication Act had the principle of universal service. So, and that becomes part of the cost recovery mechanism.
Before we run out of time, I want to get your take on the upcoming or potential upcoming Spectrum auctions.
Spectrum is a very exciting initiative. I will tell you, again, I think Spectrum is a great opportunity. We're all mobile. We all want Spectrum and mobility. My concern on the way the past auctions have gone is that probably about 80% of the spectrum is held by two large carriers. And we see more and more of that nationwide presence. What happens is when a large carrier buys that spectrum, they have a build-out requirement, and that build-out requirement is by population. So they can essentially build out in their urban areas and never have to build out to the rural areas. We'd love to see some smaller licensing areas. So my carriers, about half of whom already do own spectrum, they just can't do much with it due to interoperability and access to handsets, but that they can build out within their own communities. It's kind of a Swiss cheese effect, if you will.
Smaller licensing areas, and what else would enable more small carrier participation?
So I think I think the licensing is key, because I think the licensing is daunting for them to even get into, because you're not going to buy the Lexington market when all you really want to do is serve Eastern Kentucky. You really don't want to serve all the metro areas. Interoperability, being able to get that interoperability between the carriers and some of those roaming agreements are really important so that you can actually hand off that traffic. My guys can make a business case out of it. I've got 100 companies that own 700 megahertz, and very few have the ability to do anything with that spectrum. Again, as I think customers continue to yearn for both the speed and the capacity that fiber can build, you want to augment that with mobility with the spectrum.
I'm curious if we can jump topics now
Absolutely.
to the problems that your members have been facing with calls not completing. This is a big deal. A lot of people in cities might not know it, but rural call completion is something that's been tasking the FCC for the last couple of years. Has the FCC and their increased focus on it done anything to solve the problem?
You know, this is a heartbreak issue, and and to your point, you're right, people outside of Washington don't understand it, but what's going on is that I might be calling, my grandmother in Michigan, and what's going on is that call gets handed off to an intermediate carrier of some sort, and usually carriers look for kind of a least cost router to carry that call, and then that call gets completed into a rural area. Those least cost routers, because the access at the other end is higher than maybe they're getting in the middle piece, are simply choosing not to complete the calls. I've actually done these test calls, and it's horrifying when 20% of the calls that you're making simply end in dead air, and you think, what it's doing to small businesses and what it's doing to people's safety. We've literally had numbers of cases of people not getting through to the surgeon or the health care clinic. So it's a real epidemic. The FCC has put some attention on it. That's been terrific. I find every time they put attention on it, we see it tap down for a couple of weeks, and then it kind of, everybody does their new tariffing and it runs rampant again. So there is an order that the FCC is planning on voting on in the next week. I think that will be a really good start. I think there is more work to be done, to be honest with you, to ensure that folks are getting penalized when that is happening. It's a life-threatening situation.
And what is the order that they're voting on?
It is an order on call completion. So they are going to be taking a look at are there ways to do some remedies that will actually tap down some of this, bad actors.
And unfortunately, we're out of time with Shirley Bloomfield of the NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. Matthew Schwartz at Communications Daily has been our guest reporter.
Thank you.